So my book is called Unreasonable Faith, Why William Lane Craig Overstates the Case for Christianity. That's the subtitle. And the book is a response to a Christian apologist called William Lane Craig and his arguments for the truth of Christianity, essentially, or his specific version of it, I suppose. In terms of why I wrote this book, basically I wrote it because, well, I'm interested in these questions, obviously. I think it's important to engage in substantive discussions about religious topics and issues of morality and creation and other things that Craig talks about. So I think it's important. But also, I was frustrated that Craig is a very prolific writer and speaker, and particularly his debates with atheists and agnostics and so on are quite popular online and have attracted quite a bit of a following. And he does very well in his debates. He's a very good speaker and a debater, and often he wins them. And I was frustrated by, both in the debate sphere and also in terms of in print, the lack of substantive responses to a lot of his arguments. Many people have written in response to Craig. Some of it's quite good, a lot of it's not very good, and there were many areas which I felt hadn't really been responded to adequately or at all in some cases. And also, what I found to my surprise is that despite the fact that Craig's been writing and speaking for decades now, there has been prior to my book, there had been no single published volume that comprehensively addressed his apologetic or the arguments that he makes. And I felt that there was a clear gap there, and I decided that I would fill it. And so that's the basic reason for writing the book.
How does he use debate techniques in order to change people's minds that don't necessarily hone in on truth, but maybe distract from truth? Yeah,
that's a good question. Craig uses a lot of techniques in his debates to win the debates, or at least perform very well in them, even if in most cases, I think his arguments ultimately aren't very good. And I think it's very interesting to sort of unpack that, to see how he can be persuasive even while he has not very good arguments. I should say, I don't think his arguments are all rubbish. I think some of them are rubbish. Some of them are okay arguments, but not nearly as good as he says. That's where the subtitle in my book comes from. He overstates the case, I think, quite a lot. But I don't think he has zero case. But the point is that the strength of his case, I think, comes across very strong in his debates. And I think that is much stronger than it sort of really is. So how does he do that? I think there are a number of ways he does this. One is just the way he structures his arguments in his debates. He almost always presents a numbered list of arguments. Classically, that's 5, and in the book I talk about sort of 4 of the main ones, which is the Kalam cosmological argument relating to the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning argument for the existence of life in the universe, the moral argument for objective morality, and the argument for the resurrection of Jesus. I think the way he does that by presenting a number list of arguments, and then he goes through the premises of his argument and the conclusion and what you can sort of derive from that, it comes across as very structured and logical, which it is, and that just feels persuasive to a lot of people, even if they don't necessarily normally think about things in a logically, premise and conclusion way. It seems like, wow, he knows what he's saying, he's got it all structured and ordered out, the conclusion seems to follow from the premises, and he makes the premises seem plausible enough, so it just comes across as quite persuasive, especially to people. It's not persuasive to someone who's a diehard atheist, but to people who are kind of on the fence or are not sure, it comes across as quite logical and persuasive. In contrast, a lot of his opponents just sort of in free form respond to him or present their own views. I mean, they may have a few subheadings in their speech, but it's not nearly the same level of structure as he has. And again, if you kind of already agree with them, then that will be fine. But for people who are kind of on the fence, it just comes across as much less structured, organized, and also it's just harder to remember, because you're like, well, I remember Craig's 4 things, because he had that list and he keeps repeating them in his introduction and conclusion and so on, which is good debating skill, by the way, whereas his opponents don't do that, and it's kind of like, it's just harder to remember. So I think when you have those key things, kind of I don't want to say slogan exactly, but key points that you make and come back to, it's much easier to remember, and it comes across as much more persuasive. So that's less effective in a book where you naturally have more of that structure, although I also tried to follow that in the book that I wrote, where I follow his structure and then look at the premises of each of his arguments, and then often there's sort of sub-arguments within each of those as to why we should believe the premise, and I unpack everything in a very structured and ordered way. So I try to sort of beat Craig at his own game, so to speak, by just breaking everything down very logically in an ordered way. But it's hard to do that in a debate. I think you can do it better than a lot of his opponents do, but it can be done better. Another thing that Craig does in his debate is make very liberal use of quotations from scientists and philosophers. And one of the main reasons he does this is to substantiate his premises. So he'll assert a premise like the universe began to exist, for example, and then he'll quote scientists talking about that. And that's a classic appeal to authority. If these authoritative figures, scientists and philosophers think this, then we should, or biblical scholars as well, then we should believe that as well. And it's a hard thing to argue against, although we all know that just because an authority figure says something, it doesn't automatically mean that it's true. But nevertheless, we appeal to authority a lot in our lives, and particularly on questions that we don't have personal expertise about. So it is reasonable in a sense. I think the way Craig uses the quotes can be misleading because I don't want to say always quotes people out of context. I mean, he doesn't always, but he can do that. And also, it's just that he oversimplifies things by presenting the quote in a way that makes it seem like it's encapsulated and kind of settled, where often it's not, and there's a lot more complexity. When quoting scientists in particular, I think he often, whether accidentally or deliberately, I don't know, but misinterprets the results and makes stronger claims about them than he can. There's a theorem called the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem that he often appeals to. I don't want to explain what that is right now, but the point is simply that it's a technical theorem in cosmology that he appeals to, and as I outline in my book, what he says that it means is completely different to what it actually means, and it doesn't support his argument actually at all. In fact, it refutes the arguments that he makes about the origin of the universe. But he appeals to it in debates, and it's like, oh, it's got a name, it's a scientific theorem, it sounds really impressive, and it just makes his argument seem much more substantive, and few people have the knowledge or the time also in the debate to argue against that. But because he's got all these quotes that he knows and has access to, he comes across as very well researched and authoritative, and that's something I try to do in the book as well. I discuss a lot of the quotes that he uses, but I also have quotes of my own to try to show in many cases that there's more depth or complexity to the argument, or at least just say what the relevant people in the fields are thinking. So I think if more people who debated against him were able to critique his quotes and make use of their own, that would be more effective as well. So that's another thing he does. A third thing that I wanted to mention that he does is he loves presenting dichotomies or sometimes trichotomies, like it's either this, or maybe it's three options sometimes. And you should always be very suspicious when people do that with respect to a complicated philosophical or scientific or historical question. Because almost always, I mean, sometimes you can construct it so that those are truly cover all possibilities. But usually to do that, you have to have kind of an everything else category, because you can almost always come up with other ways of explaining things, basically. And if he says that there's only two or three, he does this in a lot of his arguments, and in fact, almost all of his arguments, I think, the four that I mentioned before, part of what I argue in the book is that there are other options that he doesn't consider, and combinations of options as well. Sometimes it's ideas from different religions or different scientific disciplines. It varies depending on the specifics. But the way he divides it up into sort of neat categories, and then he says, well, it can't be this and it can't be this, so it's got to be the one I prefer. Again, that feels persuasive, and because you often can't immediately say, well, I'm not exactly sure what another option would be. And so therefore you kind of feel like you have to go along with his framing of something, but you actually don't. Even if you can't think of another possibility, it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, maybe there are other possibilities that we haven't thought of. That doesn't seem very persuasive. Actually, it should be very persuasive, because, well, why would we think that we can just come up with all the possibilities, especially if we're thinking about things like the origin of the universe or something like that? Why would we think we can imagine all the possibilities? Of course, I do think that there are other possibilities that have been imagined, and I document these in different contexts in my book, for like the resurrection or the origin of the universe, for morality and so forth. And sometimes I think that Craig just deliberately pretends that certain options don't exist, because he says that they don't, when in fact demonstrably they do. So I think one of the mistakes that people who debate Craig make is that they accept his framing of everything. They'll like take the argument that he's making and the options that he presents, and they'll just argue for the opposite one to what he says. But in doing so, you're already playing within his rules. I think it's much more effective to not accept that dichotomy or trichotomy or whatever, is to say, well, hang on. How do we know that these are the only options? Or what about these other considerations that you haven't even raised? And I think that you can do that in many of his arguments. And that's what I do in a lot of the book. So I think these are some of the techniques. He has other things that he does as well, but these are some of the techniques he uses to make his arguments seem a lot more persuasive than they are. I have quite a lot of religious friends, and we discuss some of these things sometimes. And some of the perennial areas of disagreement that keep coming up. I think there's a few of them. One of them is the resurrection of Jesus. This is obviously relevant to Christian friends that I have, and explaining that, or I should say, taking the historical evidence that we do have about Jesus and what his followers believed and so forth, and trying to make sense of that. And I think that's something worth taking seriously, unlike a lot of atheists who think that it's a waste of time. But many Christians think that the best explanation for all of the historical evidence and things that we have available is that Jesus actually did rise from the dead, or at least that that's a very plausible explanation. I think it's a possible explanation, but I don't think it's the best one. And I would just invite viewers to have a look at my book if you want to look at what my explanation is. But it's been particularly difficult to resolve this dispute because I think what it really comes down to is what sort of explanations we find persuasive. Many atheists like me are looking for mechanistic explanations which involve, kind of cause and effect in the natural world. I mean, involving humans, but like as part of the natural world. Whereas many theists find personalistic explanations, that is like a God wanted something to happen and then he caused that to happen, to be more persuasive, or at least acceptable as well. Just to explain what I mean, obviously if you don't believe in a God, you're not going to find that explanation plausible. But the thing is, in deciding whether to believe in a God, you have to look at the arguments given for belief in a God. And many of those arguments relate to, well, God caused something to happen, like making the universe, for example, or fine-tuning the universe, or resurrecting Jesus, or whatever it is, and that explains why something happens. And so it's not entirely, it's a bit of a circular process. Do you find those sorts of explanations persuasive or not, in a sort of a general context? If you do, then you're more likely to believe those arguments and therefore more likely to believe in God. And I don't tend to find those explanations very, very persuasive. I don't think they're very good explanations. And trying to go back and forth about exactly why they're not very persuasive, I think is quite difficult, because we don't have a very good theory about what an explanation is or what makes one good. We kind of know it when we see it, which I don't think is very satisfactory. So that's, I think, one of the core disagreements that underlies a lot of these things, a lot of these disagreements with my friends. Another that I would mention just briefly is the question of morality, or meta-ethics, that is, where does morality come from and what is morality and is it objective and things like that. I have views about that that I also discuss in the book. Craig thinks that morality is objective because it comes from God, and if it doesn't come from God, then it can't be objective, and there's no morality, basically. I think that's a very narrow view, but there are quite a few Christians apparently who think this, and it seems very difficult to come to much of an agreement about even why we disagree about this, because people just have different views about even what morality is, or like what it's for, or what properties need to be satisfied for it to count as objective and things like that. And it's very hard to know how to answer those questions. It's not like you can go out and measure morality, so to speak, although I think we sort of can, but there's a lot more to say about that. But it's not easy, and it's a very complicated issue. So I think those are two of the main points of disagreement that keep coming up when I discuss things with my religious friends.
Is there any mystery which you wouldn't like to see solved? Is there any particular mysterious phenomena or mystery of logic or mystery of actuality, the real world, that you would like to remain a mystery, and why?
Is there anything that I would like to see remain a mystery or not be solved? I think the answer is probably no. I like mysteries, but I think a lot of people like mysteries, but I think we should ask the question, what do we like about them? We certainly like the phrasing of a question that gives us scope to ponder and to imagine, and how might that be and so forth. And that's fun and that's enjoyable. It seems that some people like to just leave it at that, and they just kind of like to imagine, and they don't want the answer, because then their imagination's not, I don't know, they don't have freedom to imagine what the answer might be. But a lot of the time we actually like a resolution, at least to at least part of an answer or a whole answer. I mean, if we read a mystery novel, for example, or a murder mystery or whatever, we generally like there to be an answer, there's something that's revealed by the end of the book or the movie or whatever. Some people like unresolved endings, but I think most people do like to have a resolution, and that's because I think that there's a satisfaction in having the question, imagining, pondering, then working through it, and then finding the answer and resolving that. And I guess that's where I tend to come at things from. I like the question and the imagining and the pondering and the not knowing, but then also the process of working it out and the satisfaction when you've sorted it out. Maybe that's a personality thing, I don't know, but I think it makes sense to sort of value that. I don't really quite understand people who just value the mystery qua mystery and don't ever want to resolve things. I'm not really worried about running out of mysteries because there's so many, and often when we answer one question that opens up two more. So there's plenty of questions we'll have to answer and things we'll have to wonder about for a long time. Plus, if we're not satisfied with the way the world is, there's still scope for us to just imagine our own worlds through science fiction and fantasy and so forth, and enjoy all the wonder and mystery of that as well. So the notion that if we explain things in the natural world or in the real world, that kind of takes something away, as people have said historically and still sometimes say, I just don't really understand that. Again, I think there's plenty of mysteries. I think solving them is satisfying, and if you're not satisfied by that, there's fantasy and sci-fi to enjoy as well. So I don't want any mysteries to remain unsolved.
Cool. Okay, so relatedly to Unreasonable Faith, other than Unreasonable Faith, what book do you think everybody should read?
Yes. So what book recommendations would I give? Obviously, I'm going to recommend my book, Unreasonable Faith. You can get it hard copy or in a digital copy. On Amazon's probably the easiest. But what else would I recommend? I'm actually not very good with book recommendations because I don't generally read like single volume books. I read a lot of journal articles, and I also read a lot of textbooks, not necessarily cover to cover, but I read parts of them and try to learn and put things together. And basically that would be the recommendation I would give, is for people to read more textbooks. Again, not necessarily cover to cover as you would an ordinary book, but study them and learn from them. And really in any field. One particular things that I would recommend is basic science books, like just even high school level physics or chemistry, and biology and psychology. And you can learn a lot about the world just by understanding some of the basic theories and empirical data that people have presented. Another thing I would recommend is any book that covers like world history. I think that history is so poorly understood in the Western world, especially world history. Many people, even quite educated people I've spoken to, just seem to have no idea about the general scope of history and where things fit and how we got to where we are and like why a country is like this and all of the kind of basic things like that. I think I don't know. To me, it provides a framework I'm not an expert on history, but I know enough to have a framework for, why this country speaks Spanish and why this other one is poor and just how basic things fit together, kind of like that. So when something happens in the world, there's some basic framework I have to fit that in. Or when I'm investigating something, I'll have some idea, but, this has been discussed before, or like, there's 200 years of history of this. I think when people don't have that, the world can feel a lot more chaotic, that there's just things that happen and there doesn't seem to be a reason for them. They just sort of come out of the blue and it's very confusing. The world is chaotic and confusing, but it's not just chaotic and confusing. There's also order and structure to it. And you can learn about that by learning about economics and politics. But I think history is also really powerful. So if I had to recommend one book, just any good world history book, there are some textbooks, there are atlases, there are single volumes that people have written. I don't necessarily want to say one, just look up something. But I think that would be a really good use of time.
Definitely. Okay, so, what positive or negative experiences changed you for the better?
The main experience that I've had in my life that's changed me would be leaving the faith of my childhood and early youth, which was Mormonism. So I grew up as a Mormon. I left that when I was about 20 as a result of a process of finding out about things that I didn't know before, basically reading and thinking about things, which I won't get into in detail. But that was a very challenging process. I had a number of friends, or at least people that I knew in the church, many of whom stopped talking to me. Luckily my family was more okay with it, but it was still quite difficult telling them and so forth. And then, of course, deciding what I would think, or deciding my own views about things that previously had just been provided for me, like ethics or purpose in life and other things like this. Epistemology as well, how do we know things? And I mean, that's still a path that I'm on now, but I think I have come a long way since then. So that was a very difficult experience. I think it did change me for the better, largely because I was always a curious person, but it forced me to be a lot more, take a lot more ownership of my views and my opinions, and not just believe them because, well, this is what the church said was correct, but to believe them because I thought there was good reason, or to investigate them myself. And I think a lot of people actually don't do that, even if they're not necessarily religious. They just kind of accept things or believe them because, well, the smart person said it, or this is just what everyone thinks, by which they often mean like all their friends. And so I don't think that's, not that it's certainly appropriate to defer to authority, but we need to be reflective and careful about how and when we do that. And I think we should take ownership of our views a lot more and recognize that, well, I hold these beliefs and I act on them in decisions that I make every day, be it ethical or political or religious or whatever. And that it's my life, and therefore I'm sort of responsible for these views and forming them. And that doesn't mean we have to be thinking about this all the time, or even as much as I do, but I think that we should take more ownership of it than a lot of people do. And I feel like that moving out of Mormonism really helped me to see that and to do it more. And so I think that that's probably the single biggest thing that I think has been good for me, although not easy, but I think it's been overall a change for the better.